back to the Wild Dog AI podcast. In our last episode, we dug deeply into the safety and security of generative AI and its applications in law enforcement and intelligence. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of topics, not just the use of things like ChatGPT, but how the APIs are, how you set up the APIs, what that means for safety and security, proprietary information, things along those lines. And today we're going to actually dive into critical thinking and generative AI. This is a topic that's incredibly interesting to me, especially because in our world right now, there are so many expectations of AI, and we don't have clear definitions for a lot of the things. So for instance, you've probably heard a lot of talk recently about have we achieved AGI? Does AI reason? And the question I continue to ask people, and I want to bring this up today too, is, well, how do we define human reasoning, right? That's one of those definitions where we don't necessarily understand how humans do it yet, but we're applying that to artificial intelligence and these generative AI capabilities. And so I'm excited to dive into this. Anybody that's taken my courses in the past or has worked with me in the past knows that critical thinking is something I'm a huge fan of, something I constantly work on. And so I'm excited today to have Randy Stickley with us, who's been in law enforcement, been an intelligence analyst in law enforcement for a very long time, and Heather Perez, who you all know, who's been on the podcast a few times now, who has also got a significant amount of experience in law enforcement as an intelligence professional. So before we dive into it, Randy, can you just give our viewers a quick background of who you are and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. First and foremost, thank you, Buddy, Amy, Heather, for having me on. My background is a little bit everywhere. Like Buddy said, my name's Randy Stickley. I've been in the intelligence profession 11, 12 years at this point, and mainly in that federal law enforcement and intelligence capability. Did a brief stint in private intelligence and security, which that was with a big law pharma firm, and I don't want to say which one because they might pop up with some ghostly lawyers behind me and stone me. So I won't talk about them too much, but did a lot of activities with the intel community, did a lot of work with federal law enforcement, and I'm currently on a project with some folks at a site near DC. Enjoy what I do. My entire portfolio has ranged from counterterrorism to drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, all the way over to cyber exploitation. And here recently, I've actually become a little bit of a nerd, if you will, within the intelligence profession. I think everyone should be, at least in this field, an intelligence tradecraft methodologist. But here recently, I've really, like you said, Buddy, gone back to the basics and started rethinking what it means to be a critical thinker. And quite honestly, that's something that I've become very passionate about here recently, and partially why I'm here talking with you all. So wanted to give the kind of 30,000 foot level of who I am, why I'm here, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Randy. That's awesome. There's I just took so many notes as you were kind of giving that intro, and so there's a couple topics I want to follow up on there. But Heather, just for our viewers who may be tuning in for the first time, can you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, I've worked in law enforcement for around 25 years. I spent 15 of those years at one of the state and local fusion centers here in Central Florida, where my primary focus was counterterrorism. I worked both domestic and international terrorism, and a primary focus was identifying their networks online and creating products for our partners, describing their methodologies, potential threats, and how their activities could impact our partners.
I appreciate that, Heather. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, being that we were all students of critical thinking, that recently, the passing of Daniel Kahneman. I've talked about this a little bit on LinkedIn. He's been an icon of mine, and I would recommend to the viewers, if you've not heard about Daniel Kahneman, he wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which you probably have heard of. He developed this concept of System 1 and System 2 thinking, but he really did an incredible podcast just before he passed with Lex Friedman. And it's available on the Lex Friedman podcast. And it was a fascinating conversation because it was one of the only conversations I found where Daniel Kahneman took his life's work and applied that to theorize about what that means to AI and how things are going to evolve going forward. And I just think that Daniel Kahneman's work is going to be, even more important and more impactful in this new age of, potentially AGI. And so if you haven't checked that out, I strongly suggest you check that out. But kind of just around the horn real quick, Randy, can you tell us, have you read up on Daniel Kahneman, and what are some of the things about Daniel Kahneman's legacy that stick out to you?
So when you talk about, system one, system two thinking, I always equated that to, I had a professor who became a colleague who was an employer of mine at one point. He used to talk about folks that were fast twitch versus slow twitch thinkers. More often than not, your fast twitch thinkers were folks that thought intuitively, had more of that tactical mindset when they came to critically tearing apart any kind of task or intelligence question that was put before you. Your slow twitch folks were your ones that kind of did things low and slow, if you will. They took time, they tore things apart systematically, really lent that scientific method and analytic rigor to whatever, problem it may have been, and typically lent itself to more of a strategic problem. Those are two of the things that really stood out to me just because I heard it for so many years and it was kind of a Manchurian candidate instilled into my brain. But another thing that really stands out to me is, when we talk about critical thought, specifically with those different systems of critical thought, you really think all the information that's available to us, you think everything that we have access to right now is, a feast for all. It's really a double-edged sword if you think about it, not to be the chicken little or the naysayer of the group. But when we think about critical thinking, we typically, on the backside of that, think about biases, and they're everywhere. It's something we can't avoid as human beings. And typically our biases can stem from four different things. They can stem from too much information, which I'm sure we're going to touch on, later in the podcast. They can stem from information sources that don't really have enough meaning, which, again, in the world of open source and AI, it definitely has that capability because there's no real assessment and verification of that user-developed content. There's also that need, going back to system one versus system two, the need to act fast. More often than not, our biases can, really impact our critical thought and our analyses by the need to get something out the door, that kind of pejorative sense that, hey, this needs to be done now for the sake of it being done. You really throw away the validity and actionable nature of that intelligence. But then also things such as, what should we remember? And that's just as simple as your inherent biases, your implicit biases take precedent over whatever it is that your topic is. Throw the objectivity out the window and supplant it with something that you're more fond of, that you gravitate more toward. So again, that's just kind of the high level there, things that stood out to me and just kind of where my mind's at when you brought that topic up, buddy.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points, and it's hard to wrap up in 30 seconds to a minute all of Daniel Kahneman's contributions to the world of critical thinking and critical thought. But I think the most impactful thing for me has been his ability to take such a complex topic and apply a very simple process to it, system one and system two, right? I kind of liken that to what ChatGPT or what OpenAI has done with ChatGPT, right? Everybody talked about language models, deep learning sounds very complicated, hidden layers, like there's a lot to that. But then you slap a UI on it, and all of a sudden it makes sense for everybody. And I feel like Daniel Kahneman kind of did that with the process of critical thinking. This is really complicated. Well, how about we just turn this into two simple things, system one and system two, and let's start there. And so that's probably the most impactful thing for me. But he contributed so many other things. Heather, I know that about 8 years ago, we were in a class together, and critical thinking was a whole block of instruction in that course. And I'm pretty sure we covered Daniel Kahneman. I think we showed the video with the gorilla running across the floor while everybody's playing basketball. And nobody sees the gorilla, right? Because they're so focused on counting how many players pass the ball. What are your thoughts? What is an area that maybe Daniel Kahneman has impacted you in the processes, your intelligence processes and workflow?
Gosh, it's been so long since I've took the course and everything. It just with the critical thinking, it's just such an important component of pretty much everything that you do. Well, at any time, but as an analyst, if you don't have good critical thinking skills and the ability to identify the biases in what you're looking at and your own biases when you're potentially writing on it, then you're never gonna amount to being a good analyst. You have to understand those theories and understand how to apply them to your work in order to be able to create something that is actionable and that your partners and decision makers can actually use, that you can actually stand behind. So when you develop something, you can identify the processes that you use and defend your analysis.
Yeah, it's such a really good point. And again, I think just the idea of, hey, there is system one and system two, and there's actually a process for thinking. If that's all you get out of Daniel Kahneman's work, I think that's a lot, right? At least you then have a framework. Good. And I think that's a good transition to what we're going to jump into first here. And so this is cool because I have a military background. I don't come from the law enforcement community, and I don't nearly have as much experience as you guys do in the law enforcement community. And so as we jump into the first topic, one of the things as an intelligence analyst, an intelligence officer in the military and the federal government, I always, when I spent time overseas engaging with people in foreign cultures, foreign populations, things along those lines, I sort of had this moment in 2004. We were doing a lot of interrogations in Fallujah. It was, I think that was Fallujah 2, not Fallujah 1. And it clicked in my brain, right? Because one of my colleagues said to me, hey, when you think through the process of gathering information and interviews and interrogations, there's kind of one norm, one known. And I'm not saying that this broadly applies. This was this person's opinion, but it resonated with me. And what that person said was, most things that people do are logical from their perspective, right? And what he meant by that is, in America, we may see things happening. We may see crimes committed. We may see how parents treat their children. And we have a reference point for what's right and wrong in that regard. But in other cultures, in other countries, we've got to kind of rewrite that entire framework because it's not necessarily applicable there. But so that comment got me thinking. And then I came to the realization that, wow, for me at least, and I'm not saying this broadly applies to intelligence analysts across the federal government or law enforcement, but I realized, well, man, that's the game. The game for me and in the intelligence field as a human intelligence guy and an analyst is the goal for me is I've got to understand what elements exist in that person's life that give logic to their actions, right? And that was something I pondered for a while, like, wow. And as I started to kind of get to understand people and cultures and how they operated, I realized very quickly, like, it's not about me. It's like, how do I understand through nature or nurture how this person was raised and how they arrived at a position in a situation where what they're doing makes complete sense to them, assuming that it's logical given their perspective of the world. And so I point that out because as we move into generative AI, it's kind of similar, right? We're interviewing, we're no longer like Google dorking. We're actually engaging with data, conversing with data, asking that data questions. And, there's a lot of hype around these hallucinations. And I think in our last podcast, we even touched on this. There's like a whole new field now of like brain surgery for language models. That's a whole new branch of occupation that's popping up. It's like, how do we actually perform surgery on these models to understand what they're doing? So that's a long-winded to say that to connect the intelligence field and what we do. I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on what I just said regarding understanding why people do what they do. And does that apply in law enforcement? Is a little bit different because I know the customs and norms here in America don't necessarily apply everywhere else. And then secondly, I love to transition into how does that apply to these large neural networks of language models and us trying to figure out what's logical to them, right? What elements exist that give them the ability to think critically and so forth. So Randy, I'd love to turn it over to you first to just kind of get your thoughts on everything I just said. I know that was a lot, but again, this is a topic that's super exciting to me. So love to hear what you think.
I'm still trying to figure out where you got a video of me running across a basketball court, but that's neither here nor there. One of the things, and I'll applaud you for this, buddy, we've been hitting on critical thoughts, and I touched on biases. What you were doing with your human intelligence efforts when you were going through your tours of duty, talking about, what kind of information is being put out by this individual, why are they putting that information out there, trying to put yourself in their shoes. That's a really critical analytic technique that I think many analysts, many intelligence professionals, I'm just going to say professionals across the board because it's not just analysts anymore, from my perspective. Many intelligence professionals, because of the ease and convenience of technology, cyber skills, AI, whatever you want to call it, they really lose the sauce, so to speak, when it comes to these techniques that can really help override these biases or these traps. What you were doing was mirroring. When you talk about mirroring, it's the if I were you or they were me, you're really trying to get what their perspective is and try to understand, get in their psyche about why that information is being put out there. I think, especially when we're talking about, and this really applies to open source, particularly those that are in cyber and social media intelligence, we really lose it whenever we're talking about everything on the internet or folks on the internet being quote unquote bots. I know there's a lot of that out there. Social media warfare is a thing. We've seen that following the 2016 election. It came out Russia, China, and a few other lone state actors were, perpetrating these attacks. But one of the things that we really lose it on is when these state actors are doing it. And this happens at the IC, this happens at the state level, at the local level, and so on. We don't understand why people are doing what they're doing. We see it, we react. It's very common for folks not to understand that if I were in their shoes or they were in mine aspect that you hit on there. So one of these things that we try to preach, or at least I try to preach to folks, is put yourself in their shoes, but then also don't take anything off the table, especially whenever you're talking about adversarial conversations or anything that comes from a state actor or even a lone wolf actor. Now, when it comes to dealing with AI and these learning language models, and I will admit to you, I've played around with it. I do very light work with it. I don't touch a lot of my professional work with it, but I found that you have to be very specific. The learning language models that I've been playing with, and again, it's nothing extensive, it's ChatGPT 4.0. But when I'm doing it, I find that with that learning language model, it picks up on my nuances. It picks up on my shorthand, if you will. At first I have to be very specific, almost too hyper specific. I have to get down to the nitty gritty, but then once it's understood where my trajectory is and where I'm going, it starts picking up on what my conversation points are. And again, it's very simple stuff. It's more or less helping me kind of put a first set of eyes on a product. One's for my personal arena, not my professional arena. But I don't want to monopolize too much of the time here because I know Heather has done quite a bit of work with this as well. And I'm curious to hear what some of her thoughts are on this, particularly with regards to AI itself.
So, Buddy, with what you were mentioning, that kind of happened to me when I first started at the Fusion Center. I was a local law enforcement analyst assigned to a Fusion Center. They were still relatively new, and I was working counterterrorism. No one wanted to help me. No one wanted to help. I was an unknown person. So I was like, okay, well, how am I supposed to do this? So when I started, I learned by building my own kind of methodology where I was kind of looking at their groups. There was an individual that had that was identified through open source that happened to live in our AOR. He was a new convert, and they were telling him what to do. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll just do what he's doing because how else am I going to learn? So I built my own system, and I was learning from them, and then kind of using that to build kind of like my template. Where, well, how did I identify these people? Where are they operating? How are they? Who is there like key influencers that I should be looking at? So to try to build my own way to kind of validate what I was finding, so that way I could identify which sources in my networks were providing the best information. And again, as a local analyst writing on some of this, I had federal agencies telling me this information isn't accurate. You shouldn't put this out. I always had a statement in there saying that I can't validate these sources, that, we're reporting on this for situational awareness. Or like, you can't really tell me it's not accurate. This is not me saying this. I'm reporting from the folks that we're supposed to be looking at. They're describing a new tactic. I'm going to share it because why not? I'm telling you that it may not be something good. Maybe it will be, but I'm not going to not share it. It's coming from the folks that we're looking at. And anybody that followed my products over the years could see like a progression where I was following these different groups like ISIS and building on, like, as they learned things, I was reporting on what was new. So you could see the progression of what they were doing. But because I built my network, but again, since I built it just for me, I didn't know if it would be beneficial for other people. So other people were like, oh, well, can you teach us? I'm like, well, I don't know, because I built this for how I learn and how I understand. So I don't know if it would work for you. So I tried it and was able to modify it. That's why when I met Buddy and his how he was teaching it at the time was exactly what I had taught myself. I'm like, oh my God, he has to be my friend, because so he's got a formalized process to do this. And now incorporating the AI into that, again, like, it's a tool. So for some of the collection, it does pretty good. But again, like with some of the stuff you said, Randy, when you're using these tools, you don't want to, I like seeing it happen organically. I like seeing them in some of their groups and stuff, so I can see the methodologies, the countermeasures they're using to stay online, some of the guidance. Sometimes when you use these tools and are just pulling pieces of information without looking at the whole atmosphere around it, then you could have a key piece of information that sounds like one thing but really isn't, because you didn't look at everything else around it. So although these tools, AI tools or different OSINT tools, are very valuable and can be big time savers, you still have to understand how they work and what they're doing with your data, so you can make sure you're still capturing everything. And then on the AI side too, in addition to learning how to incorporate that into your workflow, like for me as a counterterrorism analyst, if I was still at the Fusion Center, I'd also have to understand how these different criminals and extremists are incorporating it into their workflows for recruitment and propaganda. And that would affect how I'm looking at it in my collection as well.
Yeah, I think, Heather, too, I struggle because, this technology is evolving so quickly. And, early on, there were a lot of hallucinations in the models. At least from my experience, I was testing them, questioning them, interrogating them, and there were hallucinations. But what I've learned recently, and when I say recently, I mean like in the last 3 months, that's how quick this stuff is moving, is I do find that when I talk to people now that are trying to use these large language models and incorporate that into their workflows, most of them just have, and I hate to say this, but most of them just have really bad questioning techniques. And so it's not necessarily that. So now it's like, how much is the model actually hallucinating, and how much of it is you just asking the wrong question, right? And so I think that's something there's an education that needs to occur there, because we've talked about it before. It's like an interview. If I ask you very specific questions, you're going to give me a very specific answer. If I ask you vague questions, you're going to give me vague answers. And I feel like the interaction with the language models are very similar. And so you touched real quick, Heather, on the, how you look at these adversarial networks, how they communicate, how they engage, why they do what they do. And I understand the struggle there. I know my struggle used to be as a humanitor was, hey, look, I'm not telling you necessarily what I think they're going to do. I'm telling you what they said they're going to do, right? Now, I can tell you if there's some validity to that and what level of validity exists in what they're saying, but I'm not the analyst here. I'm just telling you what they told me they're going to do. Believe it if you want to, whatever the case may be. And so I understand the struggle there with communicating that information to people that are like, well, there's no support and there's nothing to support that they're actually going to do that. And then, in some cases, what they say they're going to do, they actually do. And I used to joke around with the intel folks I worked with was, when you look at ISIS, it's an incredible organization that we can't figure out, because they tell you what they're going to do, they do it, and then they take credit for it. And then we sit around saying, I wonder who just did that. Right. Especially in the combat zone. Like that literally was the process almost all the time. So, but kind of back on topic, Heather, I know that you're doing a lot of reporting now, and you're really spending a lot of time on these AI platforms. So what TTPs are you seeing adversaries use in terms of leveraging this technology? And just some high points, like how are you leveraging generative AI in your current workflows? And then Randy, you've touched on a little bit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, it depends on what criminal extremist groups you might be looking at. You have drug cartels that are using it to do more fraud schemes. You have like ISIS using it to create propaganda, to quickly create like posters and videos, and to do more recruitments, to run bots on different social media networks. You have it for disinformation, misinformation, where they're doing these campaigns on. That's happened a lot with like Hamas, with the whole Israel and Hamas conflict that's been going on since 7 October. So they're just incorporating it in it to help generate and create things quicker, to sow kind of like disinformation. But they've also found ways to do workarounds, because some of these models, like if I go to ChatGPT and I put in some articles, or I put in maybe some posts that I've collected from Telegram, and I want it to provide me the methodologies and TTPs, well, because it's extremist content, it doesn't want to provide those. So so in order to get the information that they want, these groups are finding ways to like jailbreak these systems, to kind of do workarounds in order to provide it content that would be usable for them. So for my collection, when I'm collecting things and testing different types of reports, in our system, if I'm using in our Indago platform, in the outline are built from prompts. So if I've got my collection of, like, let's say a day in the life of my, counterterrorism world when I worked at the Fusion Center, I would go through my different networks that I built, collect the information, and then I'd have to go back through what I collected and then develop that into a product. Using it in our system, I could create these prompts that would specifically pull the data I wanted from what I collected. So as an analyst, understanding how the AI works and then being able to prompt it, I have to be very knowledgeable about my collection. It's not just random stuff I've collected. I've read it, I understand it, I know what I want to pull from it, and that's my outline. Those are my prompts. I'm prompting based on the knowledge of the content that I collected, and I'm specifically telling those prompts, I want you to pull this data, I want to know this about what I've pulled, and put it in this format. And it saves a lot of time, because then you can just go through, like, for almost any of the different systems I use, Indago, ChatGPT, Gemini, when you're using them, they can get you to about a good 70-75% to where you need to be. But then the rest of that needs to be you going through, looking at the output, evaluating it, making your edits, and adding your own analytical insights to make sure that the AI understood. Like, sometimes it will word something in a manner that changes the context of what it is. So if you have ChatGPT write you a report and you're like, oh, this is a good one, here it is, it's done, and you haven't actually really read through it, sometimes it will make changes in the verbiage that really alter what you were trying to say in your report, what your source was saying. So,
Randy, I want to get your thoughts on that, and I just want to touch on something Heather pointed out. I would love your thoughts on this as well, is the ability to operationalize misinformation at scale, right? I'd love to hear from a law enforcement perspective. What about that concerns you? Are you worried about that? Does that add additional skepticism to your use of these language models? We just love to hear your thoughts on that. And then obviously,
Well, first and foremost, I make the joke I'm in intelligence, so I'm very skeptical of everything. But, needless to say, it hasn't gotten any better since, the big open source boom and then the AI boom, where, user developed content through your learning language models goes out there and there's no assessing or verifying. So it's a concern that people can operationalize that misinformation, that disinformation, specifically if they utilize your AI platforms to, match up with whatever their particular model or their particular credo is. I actually was taking some notes. I'm an avid note taker, and one of the things I took away from, Buddy, your intro to this, and Heather, some of the points that you were hitting on, is I know a lot of folks like to say the sky is falling with AI because they see it as a threat, but it is a force multiplier. I've seen a lot of these tools work. I had the pleasure of actually sitting through and hearing about the Indago platform. And, Heather, I'd even with the small sample set that I have, what you guys showed me, I would even argue, about 80% is completed with your all's platform. But it goes down to your analyst has to be able to ascertain, assess, verify, utilize all of their hard critical techniques to go through and do this. Now, with criminals and using this as a force multiplier, I've seen, the use of operationalized misinformation. That's not a new thing. You have a lot of your militant organizations, ISK, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Al-Houthis. A lot of these folks are going to use it for their misinformation or propaganda campaigns. We actually have a lot of folks here recently, and I'm working with some individuals from a couple different agencies on clamping down on folks that are moving product through the customs, the postal, and a couple other avenues with fake labels generated through AI and information that way. That stems down to not just the narcotics arena, but also the illicit firearms trade. If you're looking at the federal law enforcement arena right now, you're talking about your conversion kits, your triggers, and everything like that. So that's a big arena as well. But at the same time, that's a force multiplier for analysts from, Heather, the points that you made. I would go a step further and say it could be a hindrance as well, simply because there's that term over-reliance. A lot of younger analysts, and I know I'm a young guy, like I'll fully admit, I know I have the hairline of a 40-something-year-old, but I'm only 30. But I've seen a lot of folks in my time so far that have gone through their collegiate schooling. They come out and they'll quote things verbatim from their Lowenthal, their Clark, or even their, Hewer. But at the end of the day, they don't know the practice. They just know if they click it, they get that instant gratification from whatever Google search or query in any kind of database they're playing with. And I always use the analogy, tradecraft over tools. We love AI. We love all of our open source aggregation tools and everything like that. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to articulate how we got to that point. I don't know, Buddy, if you've had to, Heather, maybe you have, but if you have to testify and a defense attorney gets in your face and starts asking you about your methodology, about how you arrived at this particular point, specifically when you're talking about something as, and I'm going to use a term many people that are listening are probably going to cringe at, but you think about something as gooey as critical thought, it's kind of a niche and esoteric concept. If you explain it as, I don't know, I got to that point by clicking a button in this tool, that defense attorney is going to eat your lunch. There's no way in the world that individual is going to buy that particular line of logic whenever you're explaining how you arrived at that conclusion. So one of the things that I always tell people is learn how to explain yourself, learn how to do your methodology, your tradecraft, particularly with how you process information. If you don't know how to process your own information, how can you expect to explain it to everyone else? But once analysts get to that point, and I feel like we can eventually catch up with the expanding, or at least try to catch up with the expanding rate that your AI models and learning language folks are moving at, we might be able to start lending a lot more of those critical thinking skills to that. But at this point, again, not being the pessimist in the room, but there's a lot of over-reliance here recently, particularly with a younger cadre of analysts that are coming in. So that's why I think a lot of this leans back on, kind of the central premise of this discussion being, how can we go back to our critical thinking and what makes us true intelligence professionals?
Yeah, Randy, I love the point you're making in terms of experience too. Interpretation is extremely important when we're using these tools. And I was actually told by an imam in the Middle East about 10 years ago. We were having a pretty philosophical conversation around just extremism and why extremists do what they do and how they justify their behaviors and so forth. And one of the things he brought up to me, which I thought was fascinating, was and again, it's kind of like Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2. This imam had a very good way of taking a very complex thing and making it sound very simple, right? And I think that's when somebody really understands a topic, when he can take something very complicated and make it simple. And one of the things he said to me was, the challenge for the U.S. government and your foreign policy is you are top heavy on thin data, and you have not enough thick data. And what he meant by that, what he was explaining to me, was that people that are on the ground in the field getting their hands dirty with the information, engaging with the adversary, learning about them on a daily basis. That's thick data. The thin data is what people read in books, right? The thin data is what you learn in the classroom. And so, Randy, what you were saying, that resonated with me because you're basically, it aligns with exactly what he told me is in order for our foreign policy, in his case, he said, in order for our foreign policy and our national security to be strengthened, you need more thick data. And you guys spend too much time in buildings and skiffs and in the green zone, so to speak, and you're not really understanding the people that are out here and why they do what they do. And that requires you to transition from thin data to thick data. And so that what you're saying is, these younger folks, the younger professionals coming into this space, interpretation is everything. And you need that experience and you need that nuanced domain expertise essentially to arrive at that. And how do you move to that place faster in the world of digital? We're operating on the internet almost all the time now as intelligence professionals. So, Heather, what are your thoughts on that in terms of? And I know you've worked with a lot of junior analysts. You still, you take time out of your busy schedule to work with some junior folks. What are your thoughts on that domain expertise in interpreting what this means really as we move forward with generative AI?
Well, I think AI, like any other tool, again, it's just a tool. Analysts need to understand, again, their methodology and their tradecraft and how to incorporate AI into their workflow. It's just a small part of it. So they need to understand what value they can get from certain Gen AI systems, whatever they happen to be using. But they have to understand, like, again, they can't over rely on it because that's going to inhibit your continued growth, your analytical skills. If I only know how to get data by using these two tools that we pay for, then I'm going to lose my critical thinking skills and my ability to validate sources and just kind of learning overall. Learning new technology should be something that any type of intelligence professional should be doing on a regular basis. Like, what new technology is out there? What do I need to learn? What can make my workflow better? And then you incorporate those tools. But then again, if those tools get taken away, you need to understand how you need to be able to continue that in some manner. So I incorporated a lot of tools when I worked at CFIX doing my work, but tools come and go. So you need to learn how to just plug and play. You look for a new one that can fill that gap. But that, again, that's understanding your methodology and tradecraft and what you need to be able to use. So there's a lot of AI products out there, like which ones are going to be most beneficial for you? Where are they pulling their data from? Because you have some that are pulling data that there was an article that came out about one, I don't remember the name of it, but it's pulling data from sources that it's not technically supposed to be pulling from. So as an analyst, like, where is this data coming from? If I'm using an AI model and it's pulling from breach data, like, there's certain data that I can't, even if it's open source, I can't incorporate that in my product.
We've got just a few minutes left. Obviously, I think it's apparent that generative AI is here to stay. So as we move forward, I'd love to get Randy and Heather your final thoughts on how we should be thinking about generative AI as we move forward. It's, what role does it play? Does it replace analysts? Does it not replace analysts? Does it enhance their abilities? Does it not enhance their abilities? Just kind of your general sentiment around what generative AI means for our profession, and kind of your thoughts. What does this mean in 5 years, in 10 years, and how does our discipline change as we move forward into this world of the unknown, so to speak?
Okay, so as we move forward, it's going to become critical that intelligence professionals, analysts learn how to incorporate this new technology efficiently into their workflow and understand how it impacts what they're building. It's not going to replace an analyst. The analyst is going to provide nuanced data that the systems cannot provide. Like when you have your domain, your domain focused, where you specialize in a certain area, you're going to be able to bring a human element that the AI can't. And the validation. So I feel like you need to kind of prioritize continuous learning, learn about new technologies, collaborate with other partners across the community and private sector, government sector, different areas to kind of just continue to grow and learn and incorporate this into your workflow.
Hey, Heather, before we jump over to Randy, I don't want to let you off the hook that easy. So yeah, I think, I tend to agree with you that it's not going to replace human intuition anytime soon. But more specifically, if I do have that domain expertise, and obviously generative AI does not have that human intuition at this moment. No idea if it will soon, but it doesn't right now. So then if I'm an analyst in your position with domain expertise, leveraging my human intuition to make assessments of the data that I'm looking at, how could I use generative AI to help me in that regards? How specifically, is there a way for me to use it or not? What are your thoughts?
Well, you would use it, again, like I would use it to more quickly process, like if I have like a massive amount of data, it can parse through that data for me quicker to allow me to get to the so what of my analysis. So it's doing the summarizations. I'm going back and validating the summarizations to make sure they're accurate, but then I'm adding the so what, like why does this matter to you? And that would be based on my expertise of watching these networks and interpreting these networks or whatever data I'm looking at.
Okay, so in that case, it's not clearly not replacing your domain expertise or your human intuition, but it's enhancing your ability to potentially do more work. Is that, I guess, is where you're
like a collaboration. It's a collaboration between the analyst and the AI.
Like a Heather bot.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, Randy, over to you, sir.
Yeah, no, Heather, great points overall. I definitely agree. Your AI models, certainly, and I don't think they will, specifically in our lifetimes collectively, that it'll get to the point where it can do your contextual analyses and lend those insights like humans do. One of the things that I think we do need to do as we move forward with it is get back to the basics. We need to have a fundamental, rethinking of our learning system and how we train analysts, specifically those in the younger generation. More often than not, when you guys have that conversation about thin versus thick data, I think about a lot of analysts that I've trained, had conversations with, and that are even part of my team currently. They love a lot of the information that is in the what if realm because it's imaginative. It's something that we want to gravitate toward. We want something to work out in our favor. Got a little bit of gambler's fallacy or gambler's bias at play. But we're supplanting our what if with what is. And that's something that's going to hinder the analytic process moving forward. And we can't expect to marry that collaboration between analysts and AI tools and platforms until we have that true back to basics, restoring that fundamental learning of how we utilize critical thinking and where does it play in overall intelligence analysis. Just my 2 cents on the matter.
Yeah, I really like that, Randy, because you're right. I think the psychologically the way we interact with data is shifting significantly, right? And I think you're right. Like, how do we now some of that I actually think about this quite a bit in terms of when I look at my daughters, they're engaging with smart devices all day. So their brains are wired a little bit differently than mine. And my brain's probably wired a little bit differently from you guys because I've got at least a decade on you, Randy. So I didn't grow up with cell phones and I didn't grow up with the internet. And so I've had to sort of train myself on things that are probably intuitive to you and Heather. But even more so to my daughters, there are things that are just intuitive to them that aren't intuitive to you guys. So I think you hit a really good point there, which is we've got to consistently be training. And Heather brings this up all the time. Generative AI is just a tool in the toolkit. And I love your point about getting back to the basics, right? It's like shooting a weapon. No matter what weapon you're shooting, breathing doesn't change, trigger squeeze doesn't change, sight alignment doesn't change. Like the fundamentals always exist no matter how capable your weapon is. And oh, by the way, everybody's got access to weapons, just not us, right? So it's our ability to use that weapon better than our adversary gives us, the dominance in the fight. And I think the same thing applies here too. So I do agree. Getting back to fundamentals is critically important. Thank you guys for taking the time today. One, to share your experience with us. It's I'm honored to be with two people with so much. I'm surrounded by over 40 years of law enforcement intelligence experience on this podcast. So that's pretty awesome. At the end of the day, it's not man versus machine, but man with machine. As both Randy and Heather have showed us in this podcast that the true power lies in combining AI's capabilities with our honed analytical skills. Let's continue to innovate, question, and adapt. And until next time, let's keep sharpening our minds and tools. Thank you for joining us, and stay curious.